We all have plans, ambitions, and goals, right? And we all want to bring to this journey called life our unique gifts and leave a lasting imprint. Many of you have already mapped out your future and you know exactly where you're going. Some of you have already arrived at your chosen destination. But what if unforeseen detours suddenly emerged? What if the future looked dramatically different than the life you had planned for? Would you be able to take that detour and go down a different path? In 2003, I was living the good life. I was married to the man of my dreams. Excuse me. 2003, I was living the good life. I was married to the man of my dreams. I had 2 healthy school-aged children. I was well-traveled and educated. I had had the opportunity to see the world. By all accounts, I had achieved my American dream. And yet, I could hear deep inside of me the rumblings of discontent. The rumblings were hardly audible at first, but I found myself asking questions like, what stones have I left unturned? What passions or desires have I not pursued? And then I started to ask myself the deeper question, what is my purpose? I believe we all reach a point in our lives when we start to search for something deeper, richer, more substantive. We want the sum total of our life to add up to something more. This is my story. Back in 2003, and the good life. I was climbing the professional ladder when the company that I worked for suddenly had sold. On my first day of unemployment, I caught an Oprah episode that would change my future. Oprah opened the show by saying, if you're a woman in your 40s and you're trying to figure out what you're going to do with the rest of your life, this is your show. Now, I'm not one who is prone to taking direction from a talk show host, but when she said, grab a pen and paper, I did as she said. That day, she had an author on by the name of Paul Bronson, who had written the book, What Should I Do With My Life? It was Bronson's assertion that we spend the first half of our life preparing for what we're really meant to do in the second half of our life. As a child, I dreamed of travel to exotic and far-off places. After graduating from college, I had the opportunity to travel beyond the borders of the city I had grown up in. For 12 months, I traveled to the far corners of the earth and lived out of a backpack on a student's budget, or should I say lack thereof. And what I learned was that most of mankind does not live like the peers that I had grown up with. This year of travel through third world countries was a life-changing experience and changed my perceptions at a very young age. The things that I experienced affected me at the core of my being. In particular were the images that were seared into the footage of memory in Calcutta, India. Calcutta is an intense bombardment of senses. The sights, smells, and sounds generally are not pleasant. The suffering and the poverty is overwhelming. The sadness and the despair will take your breath away. So I hid in my hostel, paralyzed and depressed for days, not being able to face the harshness of this new reality. All these years later, I have never forgotten those images and experiences. Fast forward 30 years and back to the Oprah episode. Like the travel was a catalyst for a new perspective, that Oprah show was a catalyst to a new chapter in life. Following the show, I wrote down the things that I wanted to accomplish in the second act. The last item on my list was to dedicate 5 hours a week to a service project. List in hand, I headed to the store. I read Bronson's book cover to cover that night. And the next day, I distributed 8 copies of the book to like-minded individuals. And 3 short days later, I was on a plane in search of me. It was in the days that followed that my future started to take hold as I traveled through the rural mountain villages of Mexico. Armed with some photos of my journey, I returned home to a meeting to summarize my experience with 8 people to whom I had given copies of Poe's book. When I arrived, there were 62 people gathered, most of whom I had never met. I showed images of impoverished kids who had been born with severe facial deformities. These were kids who would never go to school. They would never have a girlfriend or a boyfriend. They would never get married. They would never have jobs. They would never do all the things in life that we take for granted. And sadly, many would never experience something as tender as a first kiss. All for lack of access to a surgical procedure. The barrier, the roadblock, was poverty. I asked the assembled group for their suggestions and spare change. At the conclusion of the meeting, a stranger asked me, "Does this get you started?" That check for $10,000 validated my vision for what would become Smile Network. 11 years ago, it was an idea on a piece of paper. Today, this organization has a network of thousands of volunteers who provide the world's poorest children with the gift of a smile. In the space of 45 minutes, and for just $500, we're able to provide a life-altering surgery. I have been blessed to meet so many amazing people along the way, and I'd like to introduce you to a few of them. First of all, there is Lucila. She is the proud mother of 3. In Lucila's remote Peruvian mountain community, a baby born with a cleft is considered a curse. Villagers believe that if the cursed child is allowed to live amongst them, their crops will die and their livestock will perish. But worse yet are the actions that the mothers of these children are expected to take. Abandon their babies in a field to die. Leave them. Despite these very demands from the villagers, Lucila fled with her newborn son, David, leaving the only home she had ever known. She found her way to our surgical team that knew they had to bring a smile to this beautiful little boy's face. 1 year later, we traveled to Lucila's village at 14,000 feet in the Andes to find out how the story ended. On a crisp morning, we found a woman and her son. The curse gone, the cleft repaired, erasing the pain and discrimination, and leaving only dignity and hope, and a beautiful smiling boy with a bright new future. And then there is Sergio Rodriguez. People in his mountain village whispered he was cursed. Whenever Sergio smiled at someone, that person would look away. Then one day, Sergio's mother heard the story rumbling through the village that American doctors were coming. At 10 years old, Sergio and 4 of his buddies walked down a mountain on a shoeless 17-hour journey. They arrived with no food in their bellies and no money in their pocket. But what they did have was a 10-pound bag of mangoes that they carried the distance to give to the surgical team as a gift. The following day, our doctors erased Sergio's curse and revealed his remarkable smile. This is the same child with a very different future. This is Sergio today. I believe the word miracle applies to every surgery. I have thousands of stories, and with each, an unlikely phoenix emerges, and the stories of despair become stories of hope and inspiration. I have been touched by the lives of these kids and their journeys. I've also been touched by the lives of volunteers who have so unselfishly given of themselves. There have been so many, but I would like to tell you about one in particular. Her name is Melanie. Melanie had had a very successful run in the corporate world, and by age 50, she was able to retire, deciding to spend the next 50 years doing what she had spent the first 50 years preparing for. This is what I want you to know about Melanie. She does what she says she is going to do. She is opinionated and feisty. She is elegant and is rarely seen in anything other than designer clothing. Melanie rarely gets her hands dirty. She never had children of her own. We brought her to a surgical site. We put her to work in her designer clothing with her perfectly coiffed hair and her manicured hands. Her job was to bathe the babies before surgery. The first baby we gave her had a full diaper and with clothes so crusted with mud, I'm sure they would have stood on their own. I must admit, Melanie was a little weak at the knees at the beginning of the week, but by the end, she was into it. For a woman who had never had kids, the act of bathing children stirred something deep inside of her. I believe she found her passion, her life's purpose, somewhere in that muddy bathwater. She boldly declared that she was going to raise $1 million for these kids to sustain the work. Melanie became my friend and my mentor. I recall a particular mentoring session. I was feeling defeated, tired, worn out by the never-ending demands of running a charity on a shoestring budget. Melanie scolded me. She said, "Your problem is that you want every day to be a mountaintop. How can you take in the full majesty of the mountain if you don't spend time in the valley?" She pushed me. She challenged me. Shortly after that exchange, I learned my friend had suddenly passed. I was devastated. How could such a good person be taken in the prime of her life? And why had she not been given the chance to put the first 50 years of life's experience to her life's purpose of giving back? I never forgot her mountaintop reprimand. She challenged me to climb harder, higher. Much has happened in that decade since I first heard those rumblings of discontent and asked myself, what is my purpose? In that span of time, I have made friends along the way with people who have made my life deeper, richer, and more substantive. The sum total did add up to something far greater than the sum of the parts. I'm growing older, and like many of you, I have experienced major life changes. Notably, my children are now grown and have left for college. And sadly, my husband and I went through an unforeseen separation. There were days I wasn't sure I was going to survive. There were nights I got down on my hands and knees and I prayed. No, I begged that the gaping hole in me would heal. I was crippled emotionally and I teetered on the edge. I have always been a warrior, had a warrior's heart, but I was losing my will to fight. Witnessing my sadness, a friend said to me, "There is a reason why the windshield is so much bigger than the rearview mirror. Don't let the past define you and look to the future." As I slowly started to emerge from that fog and started to share my story, I learned that there were others who were experiencing many of the same things. Their pain or their loss brought on by similar circumstances, but also by other kinds of life setbacks. Loss of a job, a serious health crisis, or the death of a spouse, a parent, or worse yet, a child, and that list grew. There were others hurting just like me, and when I listened to their pain, my pain began to feel different. As I came out of my darkness, new truths started to emerge, and this is what I learned. In moments of unrest, or in the extreme cases when we have suffered from the experience of life's changes, it is in those moments that our under-nurtured passions and our secret desires start whispering to us and sometimes change the course of our lives. We become hyper-aware of what is really important and what is merely routine or noise intruding on life. How many of you hear that little voice inside of you whispering the secret desires of your heart and soul? The whisper may be muffled, but when we are forced into assessing the path that we have traveled and the reasons that we have arrived at this destination, we often discover about ourselves gifts that we didn't even know that we had. So what if we tuned out all the voices in our head and only listened to the voices in our heart? Intent on listening to the whispers of my own heart, I recounted those painful nights of being alone with my thoughts and asking for answers as to why the pain and loss that I was experiencing was so great. And finally, there came a moment of clarity, and I understood that it wasn't supposed to be quick, and it wasn't supposed to be easy. This detour had a purpose. I was supposed to feel the pain to such an extent that it would leave an imprint on my DNA. The universe wanted me to know what it felt like to be dismissed, abandoned, and rejected at its very deepest levels. Okay, about now you might be asking yourself, wasn't this a TEDx about the pursuit of purpose? As human beings, we heal when we hear other people's pains, and we feel free to speak the truth. When we hear the words and experiences of others, we open ourselves to new possibilities because our experiences and stories contain the answers to each other's questions. What we cannot find in searching through the riches and rubbles of our own life, we find in the witnessing of others. When I watched Lucilla claim her son's life, I believed I could do it too. And when I learned of Sergio's great courage to embark on a journey down a mountainside I knew that I could make it up to the next mountain peak. And sisters and brothers, when I hear your stories in times of adversity and witness your journey of putting one foot in front of the other, I believe that I can make it to the other side of my own darkness. In the passing of our stories, we speak to one another's hearts. And we all know someone who is suffering. We all know someone who has less. And we are all capable of making a difference in the lives of someone else. I'd like to share with you one last anecdotal story. In the midst of the wreckage of my life, everything that I love most was slipping away. The fairy tale beginning of a love story would soon disintegrate into an illusion. Had it not been for my children and the work that I do that sustains my goodness, my belief in goodness, I wouldn't be here today. Had it not been for angels, both here and on the other side, I wouldn't be able to tell you my story. Last summer, a friend and I were having a philosophical discussion about our time on earth. She said, life is too short to be sad indefinitely. That friend gave my warrior's heart permission to put down my ammunition. It was a turning point for me, and in that moment, I threw my hands in the air and I declared to anyone within earshot, I surrender. With that said, there was a knock at the front door. Flashback. Remember the volunteer Melanie and her declaration, before I'm done, I will raise $1 million? The courier delivered her will to me. I read it, and I wept. Her donation to Smile Network had exceeded $1 million. She made a promise, and she kept it. I knew that this was a turning point. I knew that in announcing to the universe, I surrender, the universe was telling me that a new chapter can begin. You see, I thought I was at a point in my life where I could wind down, dig my feet in the sand, hold the glass of wine in one hand, and my husband's hand in the other. I wanted to watch the sun go down on a beach with him as often as possible. Given the choice and a different set of circumstances, I'm sure that's what I would have done. But with Melanie's will in hand, I understood that my life's work was just beginning and that I was being asked to take my pain and to go out into the world and to make a difference. Melanie said, climb higher, climb harder. She didn't tell me that there would be unforeseen roadblocks, detours, and unseemingly insurmountable hurdles. I have spent more time wallowing in the valley than I care to admit. But today I can tell you that the view from this mountaintop is majestic. It does not matter where you come from, the road that you traveled to today's destination. It only matters that you have compassion and you engage in that which moves you. There is a child, a friend, a stranger who needs your guidance and support and your time. An enlightened Mother Teresa once said, do not come to Calcutta, stay where you are. Find your own Calcutta. Find the sick, the suffering, and the lonely right there where you are, in your own homes and in your own families, in your workplace and in your schools. You can find Calcutta all over the world if you have the eyes to see. Everywhere you go, you find people who are unwanted, unloved, uncared for, just rejected by society, completely forgotten, completely left alone. The world is a much smaller place than it used to be. We are global citizens in a global community. Each of you, in your own unique way, is amazing. You have a story and you have a purpose. Build on your life's experiences because each step of the journey takes you to the next place. Allow your stumbling blocks to become your stepping stones. And listen to that little voice inside of you. Your heart will never misguide you. Be there for someone, inspire, encourage, and support one another to be the very, very best version of you that you are truly meant to be. And therein lies your life purpose. Thank you.